What if I told you that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one yelling demanding attention or throwing their weight around? It's the quiet one in the corner, the one who's been pushed too far, the one who's been observing, feeling, and learning. That line might sound dramatic, but Carl Jung would say it's psychologically accurate. Jung believed that every person carries both light and shadow within them. And nowhere is that more misunderstood than in the empath. Most people think empaths are soft, passive, too emotional. But what if I told you that real empaths, the ones who've been betrayed, dismissed, and manipulated, aren't fragile? They're forged. See, Jung's work reveals something powerful. The people who feel the most deeply are also the ones who've walked through the most darkness. Not because they asked for it, but because life kept handing them situations that forced them to grow quietly. And when someone like that, someone with profound emotional intelligence and years of stored wisdom, finally hits a breaking point, they don't explode. They evolve. Empaths don't stay broken. They rebuild themselves with boundaries, clarity, and discernment. So if you've ever underestimated an empath or been one yourself, this video might change the way you see everything. Because once they integrate both their light and their shadow, they become something rare. Not reactive, not cruel, but deeply aware and absolutely unshakable. And that's the moment the game changes, not just for them, but for everyone who ever tried to control them. Let's explore what Carl Jung discovered about this transformation and why the awakened empath is the last person you should ever try to manipulate. Let's clear something up right now. Empaths are not weak. In fact, what Carl Jung discovered about them flips the entire narrative on its head. Empaths don't fall apart because they feel too much. They survive because they've learned how to hold everything: joy and pain, truth and illusion, betrayal and hope at once. This isn't softness. It's something Jung called the tension of opposites. Empaths walk through life feeling emotions deeply, sometimes even before others feel them themselves. They can spot lies without needing proof. They sense pain behind someone's smile. And yet, they still choose to believe in people's potential. They still hope. They still give. Not because they're naive, but because they've mastered what Jung called the transcendent function. The rare psychological ability to hold opposing realities without being torn apart. That's what makes them so misunderstood. People look at empaths and think, why do they forgive so easily? Why do they keep seeing the good in people who don't deserve it? But what they're missing is this: empaths aren't pretending not to see the darkness. They're just choosing to stand in the tension between what is and what could be. Think of it like this: where most people run from discomfort, empaths sit with it. They study it. They breathe through it. And in doing so, they build something rare, emotional resilience, with depth. And that's where their quiet power begins. So if you've ever been told you're too sensitive, that you feel too much, that your compassion makes you weak, maybe it's time to see that sensitivity for what it really is. A form of psychological strength most people will never understand. And Carl Jung knew it. He saw that empaths don't break under pressure, they transform in it. Here's one of the biggest mistakes narcissists make. They see an empath's softness and assume it means weakness. They assume kindness equals compliance. Compassion equals control. But what they don't realize is that they're playing with fire. Because many empaths didn't become gentle by accident. They became that way through pain. Through years of emotional betrayal, gaslighting, abandonment, and manipulation. Carl Jung said that the shadow, the dark hidden part of the psyche, eventually demands to be integrated. And for most people, that process happens slowly, if at all. But not for empaths. Empaths are often forced into their shadow work early simply because they've been pushed there. They're the ones who trusted too much and got burned, who gave second chances and third and fourth until something broke. Until they had no choice but to look inward and ask, why does this keep happening to me? That moment of heartbreak becomes a gateway. It's the point where an empath stops being a mirror for everyone else's pain and starts confronting their own. This is where the transformation begins. Betrayal doesn't break the empath. It initiates them. It pushes them into what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole by facing what was once denied. And when an empath begins to integrate their shadow, when they realize they have a right to boundaries, to walk away, to say no without guilt, that's when they become someone a narcissist can no longer manipulate. Because now they're not just compassionate, they're conscious. And that combination, heart and awareness, is exactly what makes them unstoppable. There's a quiet superpower empaths have. They remember everything, not just the facts, but the feeling behind every word, every silence, every shift in energy. They don't just hear what was said, they feel what was meant. And over time, that emotional memory becomes a kind of library, a living archive of every betrayal, every manipulation, every "I'm sorry" that wasn't backed by change. But here's where something incredible happens. Carl Jung called it the emergence of the self. A moment where the empath, after collecting years of data about others, about pain, about patterns, suddenly turns inward. They stop asking, "Why did they hurt me?" and begin asking, "What part of me allowed that?" This is the turning point, the moment of psychological rebirth. It doesn't come during peace. It comes in crisis, when the pain becomes too loud to ignore and the patterns too familiar to keep repeating. And instead of staying in survival mode, the empath awakens. They realize that every wound held a lesson. Every manipulation held a mirror. And every breakdown was actually a breakthrough waiting to happen. This rebirth isn't dramatic. It's subtle, quiet, but deeply permanent. They begin to see clearly. They become less reactive and more reflective. They stop absorbing every emotion around them and start observing. They're no longer driven by the need to fix others, because now they're focused on fixing the relationship they've neglected the most, the one with themselves. Jung believed that true strength is born not from avoiding the shadow, but from walking straight through it. And that's exactly what the empath does. They don't just survive what was meant to break them, they transcend it. And that's when they become truly powerful. There's a moment in every empath's journey where they face a quiet but life-changing decision. Do I react? Or do I respond? Because when you've been hurt, deeply hurt, every cell in your body wants justice. You want them to feel what you felt. You want them to finally understand how much it cost you to stay kind. But here's what Carl Jung discovered. The real victory isn't in making someone pay. It's in choosing not to be pulled down to their level in the first place. Most people operate from wounds. They lash out. They chase closure. They argue, explain, plead just to be understood. But the empath who's awakened, they learn a different way. They don't respond from anger. They respond from awareness. They don't react to bait. They recognize the pattern and step out of it entirely. Jung called this a sign of individuation, when a person stops living from reaction and starts living from alignment. It's when your nervous system no longer flares up at the mention of their name. When your silence says more than your explanation ever could. It's the moment you stop needing them to change. because you've already changed. And maybe that's the part that surprises people most. Empaths don't become powerful by fighting harder. They become powerful by no longer needing to fight at all. Because when you face the darkest parts of yourself and survived what was meant to break you, you don't rise with vengeance. You rise with clarity. So let me ask you, what would it feel like to choose peace over proving a point to respond from wholeness, not hurt? That's not weakness. That's mastery. And once you've tasted it, you'll never be pulled back into the game again. There's a moment in an empath's journey that changes everything. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's subtle. But it's final. It's the moment they stop playing the game. Carl Jung called this shift psychological autonomy, a state where the empath no longer lives in emotional reaction to others. They stop chasing closure. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop trying to rescue relationships that were never reciprocal in the first place. And here's what's truly powerful. It's not because they've become bitter or cold. It's because they've become clear. They now understand that manipulation thrives on predictability. Narcissists, emotional vampires, and master guilt trippers count on one thing: your emotional response. They bait you with silence so you'll reach out. They play victim so you'll fix it. They cross a line so you'll justify your boundary. Again, but the awakened empath. They don't react anymore. They detach. Not out of fear or pain, but out of self-respect. This is the psychological equivalent of becoming immune. Not because the tactics have changed, but because you have. You've seen the cycle. You've studied the pattern. And you've finally realized you don't owe anyone your peace just because they demand your presence. Think about it. How much energy have you spent trying to explain your worth to people who were never listening? The empath who reaches psychological autonomy doesn't stop caring. They just stop proving. They know their truth. They hold their line. And most importantly, they stop showing up where they're only being drained. That's not detachment from life. That's detachment from dysfunction. And it's one of the most liberating transformations you'll ever witness. There's a point in every empath's journey where something subtle but powerful shifts. They stop reacting from the wound and start responding from wisdom. Carl Jung described this as the transcendent function at its highest expression. The moment when your emotions and your intellect stop working against each other and begin to move in harmony. Think about it like this. In the past, you may have cried for people who didn't deserve your tears. You may have stayed in situations far too long because you believed in someone's potential, while ignoring their patterns. But when an empath has walked through the fire of betrayal, of gaslighting, of emotional manipulation, they emerge sharper, not colder, but clearer. And that clarity births something new: strategy. You still feel deeply. That hasn't changed. But now, you don't let those feelings drag you into chaos. You pause. You assess. You ask, is this mine to carry that pause? That's where your power lives. You begin to realize that not every emotion is a call to action. Not every apology deserves a response. Not every breakdown requires your rescue. You've been through enough to recognize the difference between emotional truth and emotional bait. This is where empaths become nearly impossible to manipulate, because now you see what's happening before it fully forms. You sense the lie before it's spoken. You feel the shift in energy before the conversation even starts. And instead of panicking or pleasing you, position yourself. Empaths at this stage don't move from pain, they move from presence. Their emotions no longer cloud their judgment. They enhance it. Jung believed that this balance between feeling and thinking, between heart and insight, is what makes someone truly whole. And when an empath reaches that level, they don't just survive emotional storms. They become the stillness that can't be shaken. There comes a moment in every awakened empath's journey when everything flips. They stop absorbing everyone's pain and start reflecting truth like a mirror held up to the unconscious. Carl Jung called this psychological mirroring, and it's one of the most underestimated transformations in human relationships. You see, for most of their lives, empaths internalize. They take in other people's chaos, their shame, their projections, like emotional sponges. Why? Because they've been conditioned to believe that feeling for others means carrying their darkness. But once they've awakened, that pattern ends. Instead of soaking in toxicity, they begin to reflect it back. Not with bitterness, not with cruelty, with truth. It's like holding a mirror up to someone who spent their entire life avoiding their reflection. They see their manipulation for what it is. They hear their excuses echo in the silence. They feel the weight of their own dishonesty because for the first time, no one else is carrying it for them. And this right here is where it gets powerful. Because truth, as Jung said, is the most devastating weapon against deception. It doesn't scream. It doesn't accuse. It simply reveals. And when someone is forced to face the truth, they've been hiding behind charm, behind gaslighting, behind control. That truth becomes louder than any defense they can conjure. An awakened empath doesn't fight dirty. They don't even fight. They just reflect. And that calm reflection becomes unbearable for those who've relied on confusion and chaos to maintain power. So ask yourself, are you still absorbing what's not yours? Or have you reached the point where you're ready to hold up the mirror gently but firmly and let the truth do the talking? Because when you do, something extraordinary happens. You stop losing energy and start reclaiming power. There's a moment in every empath's journey that feels like a quiet revolution. It's not loud. It doesn't come with fireworks. But inside, something erupts and everything changes. Carl Jung called this the return of the repressed. It's when all the parts of yourself you buried, your boundaries, your boldness, your no, come rising back to the surface, not to create chaos, but to restore wholeness. You see, for years, many empaths believed they had to be endlessly patient, endlessly giving, endlessly soft to be good. But that belief came at a cost. Their authentic power got locked away in the shadow of the very parts of themselves they were taught to feel guilty for. But betrayal has a way of forcing what's hidden into the light. After enough hurt, enough gaslighting, enough self-betrayal, the empath stops asking, what do they need, and starts asking, what do I deserve? That's the shift. The ability to say no without apology, to walk away without guilt, to stop explaining yourself to people who never really listened in the first place. And here's the beautiful paradox. When the empath integrates their shadow, they don't become cold, they become clear. They still feel deeply, but now they choose who gets access to that depth. They still care, but they don't waste it on people who treat their kindness like currency to be exploited. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming fully yourself, including the parts you were once afraid of. So if you're in that space right now where you feel the pressure building, the old parts of you rising up, don't fear it. It's not breakdown, it's breakthrough. It's the return of your power, and it's time you gave it a voice. There comes a moment when the empath stops explaining. They don't raise their voice. They don't slam the door. They simply stop needing permission to exist. This is what Carl Jung would call psychological sovereignty. It's the stage of awakening where the empath no longer needs external validation to feel whole. They don't justify their boundaries, defend their silence, or apologize for having needs, because they finally understand. And true strength isn't about being louder. It's about being rooted. They no longer wait for others to get it. They're not trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. And it's not because they don't care, it's because they've outgrown the dynamic of emotional chasing. This is the quiet revolution of the empath, the shift from reaction to command, from being shaped by other people's chaos to holding steady in their own clarity. And you can feel it when you're in their presence. They listen but don't absorb. They witness but don't rescue. They walk away not because they don't love you, but because they love themselves enough not to stay where they're shrinking. This isn't just emotional maturity. It's soul-level alignment. They've integrated their shadow, honored their truth, and reclaimed their right to exist without negotiation. So let me ask you this. What would your life look like if you didn't need to explain your worth anymore? What if you gave yourself full permission to be without defending it? That's psychological sovereignty. And once you arrive here, there's no going back. Because peace once tasted becomes non-negotiable. Here's a truth many manipulators fear. Once an empath wakes up, you can no longer control them. They no longer chase those who walk away. They no longer try to save people who've chosen to sink. Instead, they choose relationships built on mutual respect, where both souls meet as equals, not as fixer and project rescuer and victim. Because the awakened empath has learned something life-changing. Compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. And now they know the difference between helping someone and losing themselves in someone else's chaos. Carl Jung would call this an individuated empath, a person who's integrated both their light and shadow into a whole grounded identity. They are no longer fragmented, no longer trying to earn love through sacrifice, no longer addicted to proving their worth through saving others. Instead, they become something powerful, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in that steady, unshakable kind of way that you feel the moment they enter the room. Jung said it best. The individuated person is a force of nature. That's what happens when an empath stops being a sponge and becomes a mirror, when they stop reacting and start responding, when they stop negotiating with chaos and start building peace. So let me ask you, have you ever felt that shift within yourself? That moment when you realized you're no longer available for manipulation because you finally know who you are. That's not arrogance. That's evolution. Here's what they never tell you. The empath who survives the darkness doesn't just come back to life. They become the light. They are no longer defined by the pain they've endured, but by what they chose to do with it. Not bitter, not broken, but radiant with a clarity that burns through illusion. Carl Jung said, "In every wound, there is the seed of transformation." And empaths, real awakened empaths, are living proof of this. They carry the scars, yes. But those scars have become sacred maps guiding them out of the chaos and into sovereignty. They no longer absorb the energy of the room. They illuminate it. They no longer shrink to keep the peace. They embody peace even if it makes others uncomfortable. That's the shift. That's the power of an empath who's no longer trapped in survival, but standing in wholeness. They've seen the shadow and stayed, held space for pain, but didn't become it. felt deeply but learned not to drown in those depths. And now, they're not here to convince anyone, not here to prove or explain. They simply live their truth loudly, clearly, unapologetically. So maybe the final question isn't, how do I heal? Maybe it's, how can I use everything I've endured to become who I was always meant to be? Because once you've walked through the fire, you realize you are the flame.